Okay, so you guys sent us over a bunch of stuff about High Street Group, right? This whole insolvency thing and everything that seems to be kind of connected to it. We're going to do a deep dive for you today. Try to make sense of it all.
Yeah, it's a very tangled web.
Yeah, a lot of threads to pull on.
Yeah?
But I think the thing that really jumped out when we were going through all this stuff you sent over was this guy, Tony Hyams, right?
Right.
One of the insolvency practitioners. Seems like he's facing some heat.
Yeah, he is. And the stuff you sent us, these blog posts, they go into a lot of detail about Hyams, about his actions, what he did during this High Street Group administration, and how it might connect to Hadrian Real Estate, which we'll get into, but that's kind of the mission here, right?
Yeah.
To really kind of pull out what we can learn from all this, how these processes work, what are the warning signs you should be looking out for, what can you, as somebody who's following all this, what can you take away to help you in your own financial world?
So let's start with Tony Hyams, right? So he was one of the joint administrators for High Street Group back in December 2021.
That's right.
And now it seems like he's under scrutiny from the regulators.
Yes. Yeah. So the blog post highlights that on January 29th, 2025, the Insolvency Practitioners Association, that's the IPA, that's who regulates insolvency professionals in the UK, issued a disciplinary consent order against him. And it's a really important point, right, that this disciplinary action, it's not directly connected to his work with High Street Group.
Right. It's not specifically about High Street Group. They haven't said exactly what company it was, but they have said it was between November 2021 and December 2022.
Right, which totally overlapped.
Totally overlaps.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, if he's having, issues over here, what's going on over there?
Right. During this very key period, there were some serious concerns about his professional conduct.
So thinking about insolvency practitioners, they're not just, random people picked out of a hat. How do they even get appointed?
Well, they are, like these blog posts point out, they are officers of the Court of England and Wales. It's a very important position to be in. It comes with a lot of legal weight. There's an expectation that they're going to be impartial. They're going to act ethically, fairly. They're not going to favor one party over another. And it all starts with how they're appointed, right?
And that's where this gets interesting, because Hyams wasn't just, appointed randomly. The blogs highlight that he was nominated by Stephen Knight.
Right.
Of Castle Trust and Management Services Limited, which ironically is now in liquidation itself. And the other administrator, Carrie Ann James, was nominated by Gary Forrest.
So we have these nominations coming from, people that are very closely connected to High Street Group, Knight, Forrest, they were involved in HSG. And it makes you wonder, right? If you're supposed to be recovering funds for creditors, for people who are owed money, can you really do that impartially if you're nominated by the people who might be responsible for the financial problems in the first place?
Yeah.
You see the conflict of interest there.
Yeah, absolutely. Not exactly the most independent setup, but let's talk about the disciplinary action against Hyams, because, it may not be specifically about High Street Group, but it is about his conduct during that same time frame.
Exactly.
So what exactly did he do wrong, according to the IPA?
So there are 3 key violations that the disciplinary consent order outlines. And again, it doesn't name the specific company involved, but the details are pretty revealing. The first violation is what they call failure to report suspicious activity. So this is a breach of the Proceeds of Crime Act. It suggests he didn't disclose, like he's supposed to, suspected money laundering.
Which is kind of, if you're in that position and you suspect that, that's your obligation to report it, right?
That's a huge red flag. Should have been investigated thoroughly.
Makes you wonder about the oversight. So second violation.
Yeah, that's the failure to investigate and document. That means he didn't conduct a thorough investigation like he should have, and also didn't really keep good records. Didn't document crucial decisions, didn't keep those records that he needed to. You think about like a detective going to a crime scene, right? They don't just look around and walk away. They got to document everything. They got to follow the trail. And it's the same in insolvency proceedings. You have to be thorough. You have to have a paper trail because that's what helps everyone understand what happened.
Right. Transparency, accountability, it all goes out the window if you're not doing that. And the third violation.
The third one is submitting a misleading report to the Secretary of State. So basically, he filed a report about a director's conduct, but it wasn't accurate. There were problems with it. And when new evidence came to light, evidence that would have changed that report, he didn't update it, which is a violation of the Company Directors Disqualification Act.
And that's really serious because the Secretary of State has the power to disqualify directors.
Yeah.
If they've done something wrong, right? So a misleading report could actually prevent that from happening.
Right. If you're giving a report to the Secretary of State that's inaccurate, You're potentially letting someone off the hook that should be held accountable. And these aren't just, little administrative slip-ups.
Yeah, they're big ones.
The blog post calls them fundamental failures that undermine the integrity of the whole process. Because if the people who are supposed to oversee these complex situations, if they're not following the rules, if they're not being transparent, if they're not doing their due diligence, it really erodes trust in the whole system.
And the consequences for him were pretty big, right?
Yeah, he got 3 severe reprimands, and the IPA fined him £20,000.
Not a slap on the wrist.
Not at all. That's a significant sanction. And it makes you wonder, as the blog posts do, how could somebody in such an important role, appointed by the court, fail so badly? Was it just incompetence? Or was there something more deliberate going on? Were they trying to protect certain individuals? We don't know.
We don't know. But we do know the timing is definitely, interesting.
Yeah, raises a lot of questions.
And it casts a shadow, as you're following this high street group situation, on his entire involvement. Speaking of which, there's even more. Even putting aside this whole IPA thing, his handling of the high street group case itself seems to have had some red flags.
Yeah, well, there's the whole issue with the fees.
The fees. Yeah, they submitted a fee for their work, for Hyams and James's work, over £1 million.
Over $1 million. A huge amount of money, especially when you consider what actually happened to the creditors, the people who are owed money in this whole thing.
Right, because the creditors committee actually forced them to reduce the fees significantly, down to £100,000 each.
Yeah, from over $1 million to $100,000.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference. And it's a huge red flag because it suggests that maybe the administrators weren't really prioritizing the interests of the creditors. They were more focused on their own payout.
Yeah. So you got to ask yourself, right, in any financial situation you're looking at, who's benefiting from this and who's paying for it? Who's carrying the cost? And it doesn't look great here.
And the blog points out that they really didn't manage to recover a significant amount of funds for the creditors anyway.
Yeah, which makes that £1 million fee demand even more outrageous.
Right. It just adds to this picture that things weren't handled as well as they could have been. And then you've got Hadrian Real Estate coming into the picture.
Yeah. Okay, so Hadrian Real Estate, HRE, they bought up a lot of high street groups' assets with this big promise, right? They were going to develop them, make some money for the loan note holders, the people who had invested in high street group. They were kind of presented as this potential savior.
Right. A glimmer of hope. But that hope has now been completely extinguished because HMRC, the tax authority in the UK, they filed a winding up petition against HRE.
Yeah, so you're going to shut them down.
Yeah, they're done, which means there's no chance of those loan note holders seeing any of their money through Hadrian.
So Hadrian's failure, it seems like it confirms a lot of what people were already thinking, right?
Yeah.
Like what was going on with this whole high street group administration in the first place?
Yeah, the blog says, Hadrian's failure confirms what many suspected all along, and it goes on to list a few things. First of all, were those assets that were transferred from High Street Group to Hadrian, were they ever really worth the £126 million that they were claiming? It's looking pretty doubtful now. Secondly, it confirms the suspicion that the loan note holders were misled, that their investments weren't as secure as they were being told. And then I think the most damning point the blog makes is that Hyams and James, as administrators, may have ignored clear evidence of a financial swindle in these asset transfers to Hadrian. They chose inaction instead of going after accountability.
So are they saying the administrators basically let these assets potentially get moved out of High Street Group in a way that wasn't fair to the people who were owed money?
Yeah, the blog is certainly implying that.
So what's the real value of these assets and who actually benefited from all this? Who made money here? That's what we want to know.
Right. And when you put it all together, it paints a very troubling picture. You've got Hyams, his regulatory breaches, which happened during this time, the questions about how he was appointed, those huge fees they tried to charge for the High Street Group administration, and then Hadrian Real Estate just completely falling apart after getting hold of HSG's assets. You start to see a pattern,
Absolutely. And like the blog says, Hyams' regulatory breaches expose the wider issue and insolvency process that failed investors at every level. It's this really concerning idea that they were appointed by the court, they had this responsibility to be impartial, but they may have actually enabled this transfer of assets out of High Street Group, stripped it of its value, and then they didn't even want to reduce their fees until they were basically forced to.
It just raises so many red flags.
Yeah, and it really makes you think, like the blog says, if the investors, the original investors, are still waiting to get their money back, why would anyone else think they'd be treated any differently? It's a very, very valid question.
And a sobering reminder to do your research, be vigilant, do your own due diligence, especially when you're dealing with complicated financial stuff.
So for everyone listening who shared this information with us, trying to make sense of it, hopefully this has given you a little bit more of a clear picture of what might be going on. Like we said, a lot of threads to pull on. We've got Tony Hyams, his issues with the regulators, which again, not directly about High Street Group, but happened at the same time, raises questions about his conduct. Then you've got the whole High Street Group administration itself, the fees, the appointment process, and then Hadrian Real Estate going belly up. It's all connected.
Yeah, it's all part of the same story. And the takeaway is, for you got to be careful. You got to do your own research. Don't just rely on what people are telling you. When it comes to financial schemes, you got to understand who's involved, how they got there, what their obligations are. So you got to really dig in.
And that brings us to our final thought for you guys. What are the systemic issues? What's wrong with the insolvency practices that allowed this kind of situation to happen in the first place? And what can we do to protect investors going forward? What kind of safeguards can we put in place so this doesn't keep happening? It's a big question. If you found this deep dive into the High Street Group situation valuable and it's helped connect the dots a bit, let us know. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on this and exploring more of these complex financial situations in the future. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.